When we left the Apostle Paul last week, if you were here, at the end, very end of chapter 8 in the book of Romans, Paul had just hit a home run, giving us words that are both memorable and life-changing. You remember those words of Paul from last week. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Nothing. And nothing means nothing. I mean, Paul was on his game. He had it going on. That is why it is sort of jarring to read these words at the beginning of chapter 9 in Romans. The mood has shifted. Paul is clearly disappointed in and by people he loved and felt close to and believed in. Have you ever been there, disappointed in people you love and thought you were close to and who you believed in? It's hard. It is hard, especially when that which has joined your life with the life of your family and your friends are core values and beliefs, and suddenly you find yourself on a different page from them. You see, Paul, who at one point had called himself a Hebrew of Hebrews, is disappointed in his own people. Brothers and sisters of the same faith and heritage, the Jewish faith. He is disappointed in their response to Jesus and the gospel message, ranging from indifference to hostility. In fact, it is that hostility to Jesus that led them to collude with the Romans all the way to Jesus being nailed to a cross. We need, though, to remember we are hearing one side of the story here with Paul. It very well may have been that there were brothers and sisters in Paul's Jewish family that likewise were disappointed in him. After all, Paul had been one of the champions of defending the traditions of the Jewish faith from the winds of change when the movement of Jesus had come into being. Paul, never one to be lukewarm in what he believed and how he lived out his beliefs, had taken upon himself, if you recall, to squash what many saw as an insurgency by the followers of Jesus to destroy the true faith. Paul, in fact, could have been called a terrorist for the traditions of faith, a lead persecutor of those who were following Jesus. But then remember what happened. Paul had an experience with Jesus while traveling on a road to Damascus. The scripture in Acts says that Paul was struck to the ground by a brilliant light, and that for 3 days Paul was left blind. But in the course of this traumatic experience, Paul's eyes were finally opened and his heart was forever changed when Jesus himself came to Paul and asked him, "Paul, why are you persecuting me?" And Paul, who was then Saul, the persecutor of those who followed Jesus, became the grandest defender and promoter of Jesus and the gospel the world has ever known. Don't tell me people can't change. Christianity to this very day has been defined for the world and for the ages by the words of Paul. But many of the people of the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jewish people, were not happy with Paul's new revelation, new life, new direction, new insight. Paul, just like Jesus, had not set out not to reject his own people or even the traditions of faith, but rather to call his people back to their core purpose of those traditions, the purpose of loving God and loving each other.
Amen.
You remember Jesus himself said, all of the law, the Torah, the faith of Abraham, and the law of Moses can be summed up in this one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. And the second part, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Do that and you will have fulfilled the law and the prophets, said Jesus. As happens still today, sometimes groups organized for a purpose lose sight of that purpose when layers of history and multiple personalities and institutional requirements get piled on and on and on, and we forget, why did we come together in the first place? One of the joys and privileges we have here at South Maine is that we have been given the opportunity to start new, start fresh, start from scratch. I was contacted by a lady from a church in Ohio who had read the article about us that went nationwide on the United Methodist Church's website. She wanted to know how we did it. How did we get church people to reach out beyond themselves? She said she was meeting resistance in her church that was growing smaller and having a difficult time connecting with their community. I wrote her back and I said, I believe being able to start completely new was the key. Even churches that want to be welcoming and open to new people oftentimes have a hard time bringing newcomers into the old established ways and almost subconsciously send a message of unwelcome. Now, here's the thing though. We won't always be a new church. I told you when we were first started, we were infants. Now we're toddlers. Soon we'll go to elementary school, and then high school, and then college, and then we'll be midlife, and then we'll start worrying about collecting our Social Security, and then we'll be so set in our ways, won't we? That can happen before we know it. And so, like all others, we will have to guard against losing sight of our core purpose while building our organization. That's why I ask you every Sunday, who are we? God's children. God's children. And why we sing at the end of the service every week. Loving God. Loving each other. That's the purpose of why we're here. Yes, Paul is disappointed. He's disappointed that as he has connected with God in a way that he was moving on in his life, and many of the people he loved and trusted were resistant and hostile. Have you ever tried to move on to a better place in your life, grow beyond where you were to something healthier or more life-enriching, and along the way you met resistance, even hostility, from those who were afraid of you moving forward? Fred Craddock, who I've told you before, is one of my favorite preachers, tells a story in which we're reminded that the Christian life is about moving on. It's about going forward. And because of that, it is sometimes a struggle. He says, we get stuck in cycles. It happens to all of us. People, children, get in cycles, depending on the family and the community, and you get into that cycle. And we speak of those cycles, cycles of violence, cycles of poverty, cycles of prejudice. There's also those cycles of greed and cycles of arrogance and cycles of superiority. And these family members and these friends around us have very powerful influence on us. And so how do we break it? He said we can love and we can pray and we can care, but those cycles are still very hard to break. We see it every day. Early pregnancy, alcohol, drugs, prejudice, greed, violence. How do you break it? He says the reason it's so hard to break is because oftentimes the people you love and who love you might not want you to break it. Think about that. He then tells the story of Clyde, who walked out of a little coal mining village in southwest Virginia with all his possessions in a gunny sack. He was leaving. He was in a family of 14 children. He had already started going to the mine, the coal mine, at 14 years of age. And a teacher in the grade school said to Clyde, "Would you like some books to read at night?" Clyde said, "Yes." And then at the end of grade school, that same teacher said, "Would you like to go on to high school?" And Clyde said, "Oh, no. I'll have to go to work in the mine. Everybody else in the family, that's what they do." "But wouldn't you like to go on to school?" "Oh, yes." And Clyde did. And then that very same teacher in high school asked him one day, "College? Would you like to go to college?" And Clyde one day walked to the highway, everything he owned in that gunny sack, and he caught a bus to college. And Dr. Craddock said, he asked Clyde one day, "Clyde, what was the hardest part of that?" And Clyde said, "It was not the poverty. It was not missing my family or missing my home. The hardest part was everybody who loved me, who was around me, said, 'Don't leave. Why are you running away? Don't leave us with all the work to do. You're betraying us.' And he said that hurt. And he kept hearing, 'Stay here. Stay here.' And he said it made you question, why not just stay here with the people you're supposed to love and love you?" Some of you know what that is like. Wanting to move on. Needing to move on in your life. To find a different way to live your life. But all around you there's voices saying, "Oh, stay here. Stay here. Don't you leave. Don't you move on. Stay here." Sometimes those voices ring in your own head. They're voices from your past telling you, you can't move on. You'll never amount to anything. You might as well just stay where you are. I think this is what Paul is dealing with here. With some of his brothers and sisters in the family of the Jews. Paul has found a better way to live true to God and true to their own history and traditions. And Paul keeps hearing, "No, we're going to stay here. Don't move on. Don't move on. Don't change. Stay right here." I recently watched a documentary on the life of Paul done by some really smart people who have studied the Bible intensely and the history of the times in which Paul lived. And many of those smart people say that we've gotten it all wrong, we Christians, if we think Paul was rejecting his Jewish faith and his own people, the Jews. In fact, did he not say in this very scripture, Jesus, if it could save my people, I'd surrender myself. Paul, like Jesus, did not set out to create a new institution, a new religion, but rather to keep the people of his Jewish religious family moving on in God's way. Have you ever noticed how the God of the Bible is ever on the move? In fact, do you remember how one of the first symbols of God's presence among his people was not a building, was it? It was not a temple. It was not a mountain. It was a box carried on poles. The Ark of the Covenant carried the presence of God on the move, traveling with a people who were on the move. God is ever on the move. And in Jesus we meet a God who is on the move. Remember, Jesus didn't even own a home, did he? He said, the birds in the air have their nests, and the foxes have their holes in which they live, but the Son of Man has not a place to lay his head. Jesus never did construct a church building, did he? He never did settle down, he and his disciples. Instead, he walked the streets and the dusty roads, and he told the good news of God's love, a God who is ever on the move. Amen. And do you know that Paul, nor any of the other early disciples of Jesus or believers, ever called themselves Christians? They never called themselves Christians. That term actually was coined by Roman authorities about them. According to the book of Acts, the early church referred to itself as the Way. The Greek term for that is hodos. Hodos, from which we get our English word odometer. You know what an odometer is, don't you? What does an odometer measure? Movement, right? Your odometer doesn't go backwards, does it? Well, if it does, you're doing something good. It measures movement. So we think of odometers in automobiles, but even now we hear about people wearing odometers that track their steps. I think they call them pedometers, don't they? Somebody was asking me about our church the other day, and I was telling them how hard it is for me to keep up with all of you. Can't do it, can't keep up with you. We see people here, and then we don't see people here for a while. Sometimes they come, we never see them again. Some come back, some don't. But I've determined that's who we are. And it's not necessarily a negative thing. In fact, maybe if we can be your church while you find the way as you move on to a better life, we'll celebrate that. Amen. Now, please, don't all of you move on or away at the same time. I'll be very lonely, okay? But we'll not count it a defeat if in the process of your growth, you go on. We want you to go on. We want you to grow. I think one of the teachings of 12-step recovery, and if you're part of a recovery group and I'm wrong, you correct me. One of the teachings is the importance of establishing new playgrounds and new playmates, right? Now, it may be hard. No doubt it's hard sometimes to do that. But sometimes when we move on, we have to move on from those places of our old lives. And sometimes when we move on, we have to leave behind those who are content to stay stuck in the old self-destructive habits, right? It's hard, but sometimes necessary. But when you do move on, please know you are not alone. For God is on the move with you. And along the way, we'll be your travel agent, okay? And your companions. As you find the way and keep going. Where are you this morning? Are you ready to move on? Move on. To follow the way of God. And move on. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, the movement you came to launch was not about throwing out the ways of God that had come before.